Hello again. In the modern Western world, poverty is often treated as an unfortunate condition which afflicts some members of society, often as a random misfortune. We know that it affects certain ethnic minorities more than others, and we know too that there are other ethnicities which are less prone to poverty than the majority of the population. People of black African origin, including African Americans and those whose families are from the Caribbean, are among those more likely to be poor, while Jews and individuals of East Asian origin are less likely to be struggling on the breadline. It is not fashionable today to inquire too deeply into the causes of poverty. That is to say, why this or that family barely have enough to feed their children, while another, whose beginnings were no more auspicious, thrive. The aim is to alleviate the condition of the poor while sedulously avoiding the apportioning of blame, other than in a general sense in acknowledging with regret that we live in an unequal society and that some people are not as fortunate as others. This is a lazy and short sighted approach, and one which practically guarantees that, as Scripture suggests, the poor will always be with us. It is important to be clear about the connection between ethnicity and poverty, because otherwise there is little chance that inequalities will ever be reduced. One difficulty is that nobody really wishes to delve too deeply or inquire too keenly into what it is which causes people to be poor. Sometimes this avoidance of the issue may be accomplished by skirting around the unpleasant things brought about by poverty and pretending that they're caused by something else entirely. The British Medical Journal in April 2021 championed a view of the matter which implicitly attributed healthcare problems among certain ethnicities to racial prejudice rather than poverty. In an article beneath the headline, Doing the Work to End Health Inequalities Caused by Systemic Racism, there was an account of various health inequalities which were associated with poverty and yet claimed to be a result of racism. The orthodox account of structural or institutional racism in society is able to account for everything from low wages and cramped living conditions all the way through to deaths from COVID-19, diabetes, and heart disease. Black people suffer discrimination in employment, leading to lower than average incomes, which in turn means that they are stressed and poor, causing them to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, and be unable to eat healthily. All these things are society's fault, and being victims of racism, the black people themselves are exculpated from any role in their own misfortune. Mental illnesses are also triggered by poverty and racism, which allows us to ignore research which indicates that black people have, racial prejudice apart, much higher polygenic risk scores for schizophrenia than white people. According to this version of society, racism causes poverty, which in turn produces ill health and shortened life expectancy. It is a vicious circle because the poverty also results in poor educational outcomes for children, who in turn are doomed to lowly paid employment, thus continuing the cycle. What happens to this simple and appealing picture if, as a thought experiment, we remove structural racism from the scenario and hypothesize that it does not exist? A vital part of the whole sequence is now missing, and in its absence, we are compelled to ask some searching questions, such as why are black people poor? If racism is not the cause of many of their difficulties, then how does this state of affairs arise? Would the removal of racial prejudice improve the material well being of black people? Or do the reasons for their lack of wealth lay elsewhere? In London, many black people live in areas which have a reputation for poverty, crime, and disorder. Hackney and Tottenham are good examples of this tendency. These are both classic inner city districts. In the outer suburbs of the capital and small towns just beyond the suburbs, there are fewer black people. Leafy places like Richmond and Kew, Chigwell, Loughton, and Buckhurst Hill. They're towns in Essex close enough to London to count as suburbs in all but name. They're mostly white, but have substantial minorities of Jews, people of Indian origin, and a few Chinese. In the most expensive streets in these areas, the ones with large houses with swimming pools, it is not at all uncommon to find families of Indian origin occupying the most prestigious properties. In such streets, one knows perfectly well that none of the families are likely to be from Africa or the Caribbean. This is not a question of racist estate agents who refuse to sell houses to black people or hostile neighbours who don't want to see the neighbourhood going downhill. It is simply that while people of white European heritage, including Jews, together with some others of Indian or Chinese origin, can afford the more luxurious homes in these wealthy areas, no black person could even dream of affording such properties. Obviously, racism alone cannot account for the state of affairs outlined above. If it did, then it would be a very peculiar and atypical kind of racism, one which favoured some visible minorities and militated against others. It might be helpful to see how poverty was viewed until relatively recently. This is because older views of this subject are not muddled up with theories about racism, and may therefore give us a perspective which is unfamiliar to many in the modern world. In Victorian Britain, philanthropists often drew a distinction, even an opposition, between the deserving poor and other types of paupers. Some people in workhouses and slums were felt to be the victims of circumstance through no fault of their own. Others were feckless and idle and ought to be encouraged to pull themselves together and change their attitude to life. This idea was incorporated into legislation, specifically the 1834 Poor Law. This distinguished between the deserving poor, who were old, incapable, or had fallen upon hard times despite doing their best, and the undeserving, whose poverty was a result of their idleness or poor lifestyle. There was in the 19th century, and not only in Britain, but what we might call the Anglo-Saxon world generally, a strong belief in self-help. In 1859, Samuel Smiles published what has been described as the Bible of mid-Victorian liberalism. His book Self-Help was meant to be a guide and inspiration for ordinary people, encouraging them to lift themselves out of poverty by adopting the principles of hard work and thrift. This view of poverty has rather fallen from fashion today, and it's all too often seen as an unexpected act of God, which the state should feel obliged to mitigate in any way possible. If it's not a chance misfortune, then it must always be somebody else's fault, but never that of the poor person himself. Thinking in such terms is seen as heartless and cruel. For want of any other obvious explanation, then racism on the part of society as a whole may be invoked. But if it is true that poor health, lesser chance of owning one's home, and a host of other things associated with low income are connected with some of the poor outcomes in life which affect black people, then it might be worth inquiring into why black people in Britain and the United States tend to be poorer than those of Asian origin, who might also be reasonably expected to suffer the ill effects of racial prejudice. Material success in life is, of course, not entirely brought about by industry and thrift. A good start in life certainly goes a long way towards helping a young person along a trajectory which leads to working in a high status profession, which in turn usually brings about financial stability and a good standard of living. Not everybody in society starts from the same position. It is by looking at those who did start from the same position that we might glean some insight into the sort of things which might bring about poverty and other actions which might mitigate or even reverse that unfortunate and undesirable condition. What about those people who arrive in a foreign country with no money and little more than the clothes which they had on their backs? How do they and their families do? In Britain during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, many people arrived from former colonies like the islands of the Caribbean, and the countries of the Indian subcontinent. Families of Indian heritage also came to Britain from Africa, having felt the need to leave countries such as Kenya and Uganda. Those leaving Uganda came to Britain as refugees who had been stripped of all their wealth and belongings. It's impossible to track the origins and progress of all families belonging to various nationalities or ethnic groups, but we're certainly able to date today to see how well they are doing relative to the average British citizen. According to the Office for National Statistics, a department of the United Kingdom government which is charged with collecting and publishing data on life in the British Isles, there is a great disparity between how those who come from Indian families are doing as opposed to black people who come primarily from Africa and the Caribbean. The figures for income make fascinating reading. The highest incomes, more than £1,000 a week, are earned by 28% of British people. There's wide variation, though, between ethnic groups who make up that average. Two figures are of special interest. Among those of Indian origin, 46% are earning at this highest rate, while only 20% of black people are doing so. The percentages are reversed the lower down the income scale one moves. Looking at those who earn between £300 and £399 a week, which makes up 11% of the population, it is observed that just 6% of Indians fall into this bracket, set against 15% of black people. We note too that the rates of unemployment for those of Indian heritage are half those for black people. 8% of black people are out of work, while only 4% of people of Indian heritage in that position. Once again, we remark that if racism was really to account for this greatly increased proportion of unemployed black people, then it's a very selective kind of racism, one which affects Africans and Caribbeans but not Indians. What are we to make of such disparity of income and unemployment? The first thing to remember is that none of those people come from long established and wealthy British backgrounds. It may well be that the children of an English duke or banking magnate come from families with inherited wealth stretching back to the 18th century, but that's not the case with almost any person in Britain from an Indian or black family. The overwhelming majority came to the country in search of better fortune than they enjoyed in their place of birth. Any difference of income is likely to be rooted in their attitude and behaviour after arriving in their chosen destination. I believe that racism is not the root cause of the disparities seen between the success of ethnic minorities in Britain, but there is a deeper and more fundamental cause, one which I hope to explore in further videos building upon the ideas which I've outlined this morning.